Hello there and welcome. Tonight's gentle journey explores one of humanity's most enduring mysteries, the relationship between mind and body. Can your thoughts, memories, and sense of self exist independently of your physical brain? It's a question that has puzzled philosophers for millennia and scientists for decades, and one that touches the very core of what it means to be human. Before we drift into this contemplation, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what thoughts are quietly wandering through your mind right now. Perhaps you're settling into bed after a long day, feeling the weight of your body against the mattress while your mind continues to buzz with the day's experiences. It's fitting, isn't it? Here we are, about to explore the mystery of consciousness while you experience the very phenomenon we're discussing. Now, I do hope this isn't so fascinating that it keeps you awake, but if it does, well, at least you'll have learned something about the nature of your own being before you drift off. So settle in, slow your thoughts, and let's begin this gentle exploration of one of philosophy's most persistent puzzles. Because somewhere between the firing of neurons and the arising of consciousness, between the physical brain and the experiencing mind, lies a mystery that has captivated human thought for thousands of years. The question of whether mind can exist without body might seem abstract, but it's deeply personal. Every night as you fall asleep, your consciousness fades in ways we still don't fully understand. Every morning as you wake, it returns like a familiar friend. Where does it go? What is it made of? And could it, theoretically, exist somewhere else entirely? Throughout history, humans have wondered about the nature of their inner lives. We've built entire belief systems around the idea that something essential about us might survive bodily death. We've created stories of ghosts, souls, and spirits. We've developed technologies hoping to capture or communicate with consciousness beyond the physical. Yet for all our wondering, the fundamental question remains tantalizingly open. Modern neuroscience has revealed incredible details about how the brain works. We can watch thoughts forming in real time using brain imaging. We can stimulate specific brain regions and alter consciousness in predictable ways. We can correlate every emotion, memory, and sensation with patterns of neural activity. The evidence strongly suggests that our mental lives depend intimately on our physical brains. Yet something mysterious remains. The gap between neural firing and subjective experience, between brain states and the felt sense of being you, continues to puzzle scientists and philosophers alike. This isn't merely an academic question. How we answer it shapes how we think about life, death, artificial intelligence, personal identity, and the deepest questions of human existence. If consciousness is purely physical, emerging from complex brain processes, then we are biological machines of extraordinary sophistication. If consciousness involves something beyond the physical, then we touch on questions of meaning, purpose, and possibly even transcendence. Tonight, we'll wander through this landscape of ideas together, exploring what ancient wisdom and modern science have to say about the relationship between mind and body. We'll encounter philosophers who believed in separate souls, scientists who see consciousness as purely physical, and thinkers who propose radically different ways of understanding the problem altogether. Along the way, we'll discover that the question itself reveals as much about the nature of human curiosity as it does about consciousness itself. Right now, as you listen to these words, something remarkable is happening inside your head. Sound waves traveling through the air are striking your eardrums, causing tiny bones to vibrate. These vibrations become electrical signals that race along your auditory nerves to your brain. Somehow, miraculously, these electrical patterns transform into meaning, into understanding, into the voice you're hearing in your mind right now. But where exactly is that voice? Is it in your neurons, firing in precise patterns across your temporal lobe? Or is it somewhere else entirely? Something that uses your brain, but isn't quite the same as your brain? This everyday miracle of perception points to the heart of what philosophers call the mind-body problem. It's been keeping thinkers awake at night for centuries, though hopefully not you tonight. The problem is deceptively simple to state. What is the relationship between mental events and physical events? When you think about your favorite meal, feel sad about a lost friendship, or decide to change the channel, what exactly is happening? Are these mental events identical to brain events, or are they something separate that somehow interacts with your physical brain? Consider this moment right now. You're aware of these words, perhaps conscious of the position of your body, maybe noticing sounds in your environment. This awareness, this subjective experiencing, feels utterly real and immediate. Yet if a neuroscientist were to peer inside your skull, they would see only neurons firing, chemicals flowing, and electrical patterns cascading through networks of brain tissue. They wouldn't see your experience itself, only its physical correlates. This creates what philosophers call the explanatory gap. We can explain, in increasingly sophisticated detail, how brains process information, store memories, and coordinate behavior. We can map which brain regions become active during different mental tasks. We can even predict some thoughts based on neural activity patterns. But none of this explains why there's something it's like to be you. Why does neural activity give rise to the rich, colorful, emotional landscape of subjective experience? The mystery deepens when you consider the unity of consciousness. Right now, you're simultaneously aware of my voice, your physical sensations, your emotional state, and your surrounding environment. These different streams of information are processed by different parts of your brain at different speeds, yet they come together in your conscious experience as one unified, coherent awareness. How does your brain bind these separate processes into the singular experience of being you? There's also the curious relationship between conscious and unconscious mental processes. Your brain is constantly processing vast amounts of information outside your awareness. It's regulating your breathing, maintaining your balance, filtering sensory input, and preparing motor responses. Most of your brain's activity never reaches consciousness, yet it influences your thoughts, feelings, and decisions in ways you rarely notice. This suggests that consciousness might be like the tip of an iceberg, a small visible portion of a much larger mental system. The timing of consciousness adds another layer of mystery. Neuroscientist Benjamin Liebet's famous experiments showed that brain activity associated with a decision begins several hundred milliseconds before people report being consciously aware of deciding. This raises unsettling questions about free will and the role of conscious experience in human behavior. Are you truly the author of your decisions? Or does consciousness simply tell you a story about choices your brain has already made? Even memory, which seems so central to consciousness, operates in mysterious ways. Your memories aren't stored like files in a computer, but are reconstructed each time you recall them. This reconstruction process can introduce changes, making memory more like creative storytelling than faithful recording. Your sense of continuous identity over time depends on this reconstructive process, yet it suggests that the self you remember might be partially fictional, a narrative your brain creates to maintain coherence. The problem becomes even more intriguing when you consider altered states of consciousness. Under anesthesia, during deep sleep, or in certain meditative states, consciousness can fade or transform in dramatic ways. Sometimes people report experiences that seem to transcend ordinary physical reality. Are these glimpses of consciousness operating independently of the brain? Or are they simply unusual patterns of brain activity creating compelling subjective experiences? These questions aren't merely philosophical curiosities. They have practical implications for how we understand mental illness, design artificial intelligence, make medical decisions about consciousness in vegetative states, and think about what makes life meaningful. The mind-body problem touches every aspect of human experience because it asks the fundamental question, what are you? Long before brain scans and neural networks, ancient philosophers grappled with the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical world. These early thinkers, working without the benefit of modern neuroscience, developed sophisticated theories about mind and body that continue to influence our thinking today. Their insights, born from careful observation and deep contemplation, laid the foundation for debates that still occupy philosophers and scientists thousands of years later. Plato, writing in ancient Greece around 400 BCE, believed the soul was fundamentally separate from the body. In his view, the soul was eternal, existing before birth and surviving after death, while the body was merely a temporary vessel, like a rider on a horse or a pilot navigating a ship. This wasn't simply religious speculation, but philosophical reasoning. Plato observed that we can think about abstract concepts like perfect circles or absolute justice, even though we never encounter these perfections in the physical world. He concluded that the soul must have access to a realm of pure forms beyond the material universe. This dualistic thinking resonated across cultures and centuries. Ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife assumed consciousness could exist independently of the physical body. Hindu and Buddhist traditions developed elaborate theories about consciousness transmigrating between different physical forms. These weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated attempts to make sense of subjective experience, dreams, memory, and the apparent gap between mental and physical reality. The idea reached its most influential modern formulation in the work of René Descartes, the 17th century French philosopher and mathematician. Descartes famously declared, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. This wasn't just a catchy phrase, but a profound philosophical insight. Descartes realized he could doubt the existence of his body, the external world, even mathematical truths. But he couldn't doubt that he was thinking. The very act of doubting proved the existence of a thinking thing, the mind. From this insight, Descartes developed substance dualism, the theory that reality consists of two fundamentally different types of substance: res extensa, physical matter that takes up space, and reda cogitans, mental substance that thinks but has no spatial extension. In his view, your body is a complex machine made of physical parts, while your mind is an immaterial thinking thing that somehow interacts with this machine. The brain, particularly the pineal gland, served as the interface where immaterial mind could influence material body. It was an elegant solution to a genuinely difficult problem. How else could we explain the obvious differences between mental and physical phenomena? Physical objects have properties like mass, location, and chemical composition. Mental phenomena seem to have entirely different properties. They have meaning, intentionality, subjective quality. A thought about your grandmother isn't located in any particular place in space, doesn't weigh anything, and can't be measured with physical instruments. Yet it's undeniably real to you. Descartes' dualism also seemed to solve practical problems about human dignity and moral responsibility. If humans possessed immaterial souls, this distinguished them from mere machines and animals. It provided a foundation for free will, moral responsibility, and personal survival of bodily death. The theory aligned well with religious beliefs, while maintaining intellectual respectability in an age of emerging scientific thinking. However, dualism faced serious challenges even in Descartes' time. Critics immediately pointed out the interaction problem. How can an immaterial mind influence a material body? If mental substance has no physical properties, how can it push around physical substances like neurons and muscles? It seemed to violate basic principles of physics about energy and causation. Descartes suggested the pineal gland as a meeting point, but this just pushed the problem back a step without solving it. The philosopher Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, one of Descartes' correspondents, pressed this objection persistently. She pointed out that in every other case of physical interaction, we can explain how it works through contact, motion, and mechanical principles. But mind-body interactions seem to require a completely different and mysterious form of causation. Descartes never provided a satisfactory answer to her challenge. Other philosophers developed alternative forms of dualism to address these problems. Gottfried Leibniz proposed parallelism. Mind and body don't actually interact, but run in parallel like synchronized clocks. When you decide to raise your arm, your mental decision and your arm's movement are perfectly correlated, but don't causally influence each other. God established this harmony at creation. Later thinkers like Nicolas Malebranche suggested occasionalism. God intervenes at every moment to coordinate mental and physical events. These solutions preserve the separation of mind and body, but at the cost of making human agency largely illusory. If your decisions don't actually cause your actions, what happens to free will and moral responsibility? The cure seemed worse than the disease. Despite these philosophical difficulties, dualistic thinking remained influential because it captured something important about human experience. We do seem to have privileged access to our own mental states in a way that differs qualitatively from our knowledge of physical objects. You know your own pain, thoughts, and emotions from the inside, while you can only infer the mental states of others from their behavior. This asymmetry suggests something special about the mental realm. Dualism also addressed the unity of consciousness in a natural way. If consciousness is a single immaterial substance, it makes sense that your various mental states, thoughts, perceptions, emotions, are unified in one experiencing subject. Material approaches to consciousness struggle more to explain why separate neural processes bind together into unified experience. The dualistic tradition continues today in various forms. Some philosophers defend property dualism, arguing that while there's only one type of substance, it has both physical and mental properties that can't be reduced to each other. Others explore interactive dualism using modern physics concepts like quantum mechanics to explain how consciousness might influence brain processes without violating physical laws. Religious and spiritual traditions worldwide maintain dualistic beliefs about souls, spirits, and consciousness surviving bodily death. These beliefs profoundly shape how billions of people understand themselves, their relationships, and their place in the universe. Whether or not dualism is scientifically accurate, it represents a persistent and deeply human way of making sense of the mystery of consciousness. Today, we know the human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each one a complex biological machine capable of receiving, processing, and transmitting information. These neurons connect to each other through synapses, creating networks more intricate than any computer we've yet built. A single neuron might receive input from thousands of others and send output to thousands more. The total number of synaptic connections in your brain approaches 100 trillion more connections than there are stars in our galaxy. When you remember your grandmother's voice, feel happiness watching a sunset, or decide what to have for breakfast, specific patterns of neural activity cascade through these networks. Modern brain imaging technologies like fMRI and PET scans allow us to watch these patterns in real time, revealing the neural correlates of thought, emotion, and perception. We can see which brain regions become active when you're afraid, in love, or solving mathematical problems. The correlation between mental states and brain states is so consistent that neuroscientists can sometimes predict what someone is thinking based purely on their neural activity patterns. Different regions of the brain have specialized functions, discovered through careful study of brain injuries, surgical interventions, and modern imaging techniques. The hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe, is crucial for forming new memories. Damage to this region, as in the famous case of patient HM, can leave someone unable to create new long-term memories while leaving their older memories intact. The prefrontal cortex, located behind your forehead, handles executive functions like decision-making, planning, and impulse control. The occipital lobe at the back of your head processes visual information, while the temporal lobes handle auditory processing and language comprehension. This functional specialization extends to remarkably specific capabilities. Certain neurons in the visual cortex respond only to horizontal lines, others only to vertical lines, still others to specific directions of motion. Some neurons in the temporal lobe, dubbed grandmother cells, seem to respond selectively to particular faces or objects. The brain appears to be organized as a vast collection of specialized modules, each handling specific aspects of perception, cognition, and behavior. Yet somehow, all these separate processes come together to create your unified conscious experience. This binding of separate neural events into coherent awareness remains one of neuroscience's most intriguing puzzles. When you look at a red ball bouncing across the room, your brain processes color in one region, shape in another, motion in a third, yet you experience one unified perception of a red bouncing ball, not separate streams of color, shape, and motion data. The timing of neural processes adds another layer of complexity. Different types of information travel through the brain at different speeds. Visual processing of color happens faster than processing of motion, yet these are bound together in experience. The brain seems to employ sophisticated timing mechanisms and feedback loops to create temporal coherence across different processing streams. Some researchers propose that consciousness requires a specific type of neural integration where information becomes globally available across brain networks through synchronized oscillations of neural activity. Neuroscientists have also discovered that consciousness involves more than just sensory processing. Large portions of the brain are active even when you're not focused on any particular task, a network called the default mode network. This network, which includes regions like the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, seems involved in self-referential thinking, mind-wandering, and maintaining your sense of continuous identity over time. Activity in this network decreases during focused attention tasks and is altered in various psychiatric conditions and altered states of consciousness. The study of sleep has revealed additional mysteries about consciousness and brain function. During REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, the brain is nearly as active as when awake, yet consciousness takes on entirely different characteristics. You can have rich, immersive experiences that seem completely real at the time, even though they often involve impossible or illogical scenarios. The neurotransmitter systems that maintain waking consciousness, particularly norepinephrine, serotonin, and histamine, are largely shut down during REM sleep, while acetylcholine becomes more active. These chemical changes seem to enable the bizarre logic and emotional intensity of dreams. Anesthesia provides another window into the neural basis of consciousness. Different anesthetic drugs work through different mechanisms. Some block sodium channels in neurons. Others enhance inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA, yet they all can eliminate consciousness while leaving many brain functions intact. Under anesthesia, your brain continues to regulate breathing, heart rate, and other vital functions, but the capacity for conscious experience disappears. This dissociation suggests consciousness depends on specific types of neural activity rather than brain activity in general. The plasticity of the brain reveals consciousness to be more flexible than previously imagined. People born without certain brain regions can sometimes develop relatively normal conscious experience, as other areas compensate. Adults who lose brain tissue through stroke or injury can sometimes recover functions as neural networks reorganize. Even in healthy brains, experience constantly shapes neural connections through learning and memory formation. The brain you have today is literally different from the brain you had yesterday, modified by every experience, every thought, every moment of consciousness. Modern neuroscience has also revealed the crucial role of neurotransmitters and neuromodulators in shaping conscious experience. Dopamine affects motivation and reward processing. Serotonin influences mood and perception. Acetylcholine modulates attention and arousal. Psychiatric medications that alter these chemical systems can dramatically change consciousness. Antidepressants can lift mood. Stimulants can enhance focus. Psychedelics can create profound alterations in perception and self-awareness. The fact that consciousness can be chemically modified suggests it depends intimately on physical brain processes. All this neuroscientific evidence paints a picture of consciousness as deeply rooted in biological brain function. Every mental phenomenon studied so far has neural correlates. Every alteration of consciousness involves changes in brain activity, and every brain change that affects consciousness follows predictable patterns. The brain appears sufficient to explain the phenomena we associate with mind, leading many scientists to conclude that consciousness is simply what complex information processing feels like from the inside. Many modern scientists embrace materialism, the philosophical view that consciousness emerges entirely from physical processes in the brain. In this perspective, your thoughts are simply the result of neurons firing, neurotransmitters crossing synapses, and electrical patterns cascading through neural networks. There's no ghost in the machine, no separate mind stuff, no immaterial soul directing the show, just incredibly complex biological chemistry that somehow gives rise to the rich inner world of subjective experience. This materialist view, also called physicalism, has gained tremendous support from decades of brain research. Every mental state studied so far correlates with specific patterns of neural activity. Love involves increased activity in the brain's reward circuits and elevated levels of oxytocin and dopamine. Fear activates the amygdala and triggers stress hormone release. Creativity involves increased communication between normally separate brain networks. Depression correlates with altered activity in mood-regulating circuits and imbalances in neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine. The correlation between brain states and mental states isn't just observational but experimental. Neuroscientists can alter consciousness in predictable ways by changing brain activity. Stimulating specific brain regions with electricity can trigger memories, emotions, or even mystical experiences. Blocking certain neurotransmitter systems with drugs can eliminate pain, induce euphoria, or cause hallucinations. If consciousness were separate from brain activity, these interventions shouldn't have such systematic effects. Consider what happens when brain function is compromised. A stroke that damages language areas of the brain can eliminate the ability to speak or understand words, yet leave other mental functions intact. Alzheimer's disease, which destroys neurons through protein accumulations, gradually erodes memory, personality, and eventually all cognitive function. If consciousness depended on an immaterial mind using the brain as an instrument, we might expect mental function to remain intact even when the brain is damaged. Instead, consciousness appears to degrade in direct proportion to brain damage. The developmental evidence also supports materialism. As brains develop from infancy through adulthood, mental capacities develop in parallel. Newborns have limited consciousness that expands as neural connections multiply and mature. The prefrontal cortex, crucial for complex reasoning and self-control, doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s, which corresponds to the gradual maturation of these mental capabilities. Genetic disorders that affect brain development predictably alter mental function. If consciousness were independent of brain development, we wouldn't expect such tight correlations. Evolutionary biology provides another line of evidence for materialism. Consciousness appears to have evolved gradually alongside nervous systems. Simple organisms with basic neural networks show rudimentary awareness and learning. More complex brains in mammals correlate with more sophisticated cognitive abilities. Human consciousness, with its capacity for language, abstract reasoning, and self-reflection, corresponds to our highly developed prefrontal cortex and expanded association areas. This suggests consciousness is a biological phenomenon that evolved through natural selection, not a separate non-physical entity that somehow attached itself to brains. The materialist perspective also explains the unity of consciousness without requiring mysterious binding mechanisms. If consciousness emerges from integrated information processing across neural networks, then unified experience results from the brain's architecture rather than from a separate unifying agent. Global workspace theory, for instance, proposes that consciousness occurs when information becomes globally available across brain networks through competitive processes and attention mechanisms. Integrated information theory suggests consciousness corresponds to the amount of integrated information generated by a system. Materialism addresses the timing of consciousness in straightforward terms. If conscious experience is identical to certain types of brain activity, then the timing of consciousness should match the timing of these neural processes. The delay between neural activity and reported conscious awareness in experiments like those of Benjamin Libet simply reflects the time required for neural processing and integration. There's no mysterious gap between brain events and mental events, because they're the same events described at different levels. The view handles altered states of consciousness naturally as well. Psychedelic drugs work by altering specific neurotransmitter systems, particularly serotonin receptors, which changes the normal patterns of neural communication and integration. Meditation alters brain activity in measurable ways, including changes in default mode network activity and increased connectivity between normally separate regions. Sleep cycles correspond to different patterns of brain activity, orchestrated by circadian rhythm systems and various neurotransmitter changes. Each altered state has neural correlates that explain the changes in subjective experience. Materialism also provides a framework for understanding psychiatric disorders and their treatments. Depression involves altered activity in mood-regulating circuits and can be treated with medications that modify neurotransmitter function. Schizophrenia correlates with abnormalities in dopamine systems and brain structure, explaining both the symptoms and why antipsychotic medications help. Anxiety disorders involve hyperactivity in threat detection circuits and respond to drugs that enhance inhibitory neurotransmission. If mental disorders resulted from problems with immaterial minds rather than brain dysfunction, these medical interventions shouldn't be effective. The computational approach to consciousness extends materialist thinking further. If consciousness emerges from information processing, then theoretically any system that processes information in the right way should be conscious, regardless of whether it's made of biological neurons or silicon circuits. This opens the possibility of artificial consciousness and suggests consciousness is substrate independent, defined by organization and function rather than specific materials. Modern materialism doesn't require crude reductionism that dismisses subjective experience as unreal or unimportant. Rather, it suggests conscious experience is a real phenomenon that emerges from complex physical processes, much like life emerges from biochemistry, or wetness emerges from molecular interactions. The subjective quality of experience, its meaning and significance for human life, remain fully valid even if consciousness has a physical basis. This emergentist materialism explains why consciousness feels so different from mere neural firing. Complex systems can have properties that aren't obvious from their components. Water molecules aren't wet, but collections of water molecules create wetness. Individual neurons aren't conscious, but networks of neurons processing information in integrated ways generate conscious experience. The emergence of consciousness from neural activity is no more mysterious than the emergence of life from chemistry or chemistry from physics. But materialism faces a stubborn challenge that philosopher David Chalmers termed the hard problem of consciousness. Even if we can explain how the brain processes information, makes decisions, stores memories, and responds to stimuli, we still can't explain why there's something it's like to be conscious. Why does the firing of neurons create the redness of red, the pain of a pinprick, or the melancholy of a rainy afternoon? These subjective experiences, called qualia, seem to exist beyond the mere processing of information. Consider the simple experience of seeing the color red. Neuroscience can explain in exquisite detail how light wavelengths around 700 nanometers strike your retina, activate specific cone cells, trigger neural signals that travel through the optic nerve to visual processing areas, get integrated with memory and emotion systems, and ultimately lead to recognition and behavioral responses. We can map every step of this process, predict it, even reproduce it artificially. But none of this explains why this neural activity is accompanied by the subjective experience of redness, that particular quality of color that exists in your consciousness. A computer equipped with appropriate sensors could detect red light, classify it correctly, and respond appropriately, even using the same wavelength detection principles as human vision. But would the computer experience the redness of red the way you do? Would there be something it's like for the computer to detect red light? The materialist has to either say yes, computers can be conscious, or explain why biological brains generate subjective experience while functionally equivalent artificial systems don't. This explanatory gap between objective physical processes and subjective experience extends to all aspects of consciousness. Pain serves clear biological functions. It motivates avoidance of tissue damage, promotes healing behaviors, and teaches useful associations between harmful stimuli and appropriate responses. We can explain pain's functional role, trace its neural pathways, understand its evolutionary origins, even manipulate it with drugs and other interventions. But why does the neural activity we associate with pain feel like anything at all? Why isn't there just unconscious damage detection and avoidance behavior without any subjective suffering? The same puzzle applies to emotions, thoughts, memories, and perceptions. Each has functional roles that can be explained in terms of information processing, behavioral coordination, and evolutionary advantage. Fear helps organisms avoid danger, joy motivates beneficial activities, memory enables learning from experience. But why are these functional processes accompanied by felt experiences rather than just unconscious information processing and behavioral responses? Philosophers have proposed various thought experiments to highlight this explanatory gap. Thomas Nagel's famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, argues that even if we completely understood bat neurology and echolocation, we still couldn't know what sonar experience feels like to a bat. Frank Jackson's knowledge argument imagines a scientist who knows everything physical about color but has never experienced color directly. When she finally sees red for the first time, she learns something new about consciousness that couldn't be captured in physical descriptions. David Chalmers' zombie argument pushes the point further. If consciousness is purely physical, then theoretically we could construct a perfect physical duplicate of a conscious person, atom for atom, neural connection for neural connection. This zombie would behave identically to a conscious person, claim to be conscious, and show all the same neural activity patterns. But would it actually be conscious, or would it be an unconscious automaton mimicking consciousness? If consciousness is more than just physical process, zombies might be possible. If zombies are impossible, consciousness must be purely physical. But our intuitions about consciousness suggest zombies might be possible, which challenges materialism. The hard problem extends to the unity of consciousness as well. The binding problem asks how separate neural processes combine into unified conscious experience. Your brain processes color in one region, motion in another, sound in a third, yet you experience integrated, coherent perceptions. Materialism can explain how information from different brain regions gets integrated through neural connections and timing mechanisms, but it's harder to explain why this integration creates unified conscious experience, rather than just coordinated unconscious processing. The problem becomes more acute when considering the specific content of consciousness. At any moment, you're conscious of only a tiny fraction of the information your brain processes. Most brain activity remains unconscious, never reaching awareness. What determines which neural activity becomes conscious while other activity remains unconscious? Some theories propose global workspace mechanisms or integrated information thresholds, but these still don't explain why crossing these thresholds should generate subjective experience, rather than just different types of information processing. The timing of consciousness raises additional puzzles. Neural processing takes time, with different types of information processed at different speeds, yet consciousness seems immediate and unified. How does the brain create the illusion of a single, coherent stream of consciousness from multiple, temporally distributed neural processes? And why should there be any subjective experience of temporal flow rather than just temporal information processing? The hard problem isn't just about explaining consciousness, but about explaining why consciousness exists at all. From an evolutionary perspective, unconscious information processing might seem sufficient for survival and reproduction. Why did natural selection produce subjective experience rather than just sophisticated unconscious behavior? What adaptive advantage does consciousness provide that unconscious processing couldn't accomplish? Some theorists argue consciousness enables flexible, creative responses to novel situations, but it's unclear why flexibility requires subjective experience rather than just sophisticated unconscious computation. Materialists have proposed various responses to the hard problem. Some deny that qualia exist as typically conceived, arguing they're illusions created by introspective mechanisms. Others suggest the hard problem results from confused concepts and will dissolve as neuroscience advances. Still others embrace the challenge, but argue consciousness will eventually be explained through improved theories of emergence, information, integration, or quantum mechanics. But the hard problem persists because it touches something fundamental about the nature of consciousness. The subjective, first-person aspect of experience seems qualitatively different from objective, third-person scientific description. Even if we develop complete theories of neural information processing, it's unclear whether such theories could bridge the explanatory gap between objective brain states and subjective experience. This doesn't necessarily invalidate materialism, but it suggests the mind-body problem involves deeper conceptual issues than initially apparent. Perhaps consciousness requires new conceptual frameworks that go beyond traditional scientific approaches. Or perhaps the hard problem reveals limitations in human cognition that prevent us from understanding our own consciousness, much like other animals might be incapable of understanding quantum mechanics or abstract mathematics. The hard problem remains one of the most challenging puzzles in philosophy and neuroscience, a reminder that consciousness retains deep mysteries despite centuries of investigation. One promising approach suggests consciousness emerges from complexity, much like wetness emerges from H2O molecules, or flocking behavior emerges from simple rules followed by individual birds. In this view, consciousness isn't located in any single neuron, but arises from the patterns and interactions of billions of neurons working together. Just as a symphony emerges from individual musicians playing their parts, consciousness emerges from neural networks processing information in parallel. This doesn't require anything non-physical, just incredible complexity organized in particular ways. Emergence is a well-established phenomenon in science. Temperature doesn't exist at the level of individual molecules, which simply move with various amounts of kinetic energy. Yet when trillions of molecules interact, the average kinetic energy creates the emergent property we call temperature. Similarly, life emerges from complex biochemical processes without requiring any special life force or vital essence. The properties of living systems, metabolism, reproduction, adaptation, arise from the intricate interactions of non-living molecules following ordinary chemical laws. The brain provides a perfect substrate for emergence. Each neuron is a sophisticated information processing unit, but individual neurons aren't conscious any more than individual molecules are hot or cold. However, when billions of neurons connect in specific patterns and process information according to particular dynamics, consciousness might emerge as a natural consequence. The key lies not in the neurons themselves, but in their organization and the information processing patterns they create. Global workspace theory, developed by neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene and others, exemplifies this emergent approach. According to this theory, consciousness occurs when information becomes globally available across the brain through competitive processes. Multiple neural processes compete for access to a global workspace, a network of highly connected brain regions, including parts of the prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, and anterior cingulate. When information wins this competition and enters the global workspace, it becomes conscious. The subjective experience of consciousness emerges from this global broadcasting of information across neural networks. This theory explains many features of consciousness. It accounts for the limited capacity of awareness. Only one stream of information can dominate the global workspace at a time. It explains why consciousness involves integration of information across different brain systems. It predicts that consciousness should correlate with specific patterns of neural activity, particularly synchronized oscillations that allow distant brain regions to communicate effectively. Brain imaging studies have confirmed many of these predictions, showing that conscious perception involves widespread neural activation and increased connectivity between brain regions. Integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi, offers another emergent approach to consciousness. This theory proposes that consciousness corresponds to the amount of integrated information generated by a system. Information is integrated when it cannot be broken down into independent parts, when the whole system generates more information than the sum of its parts. According to this theory, any system that integrates information above a certain threshold will be conscious, with the degree of consciousness corresponding to the amount of integrated information. This theory makes precise mathematical predictions about consciousness. It suggests that consciousness requires both differentiation to the ability to distinguish between many different states and integration. These states must be unified rather than independent. The brain achieves both through its complex network structure, with specialized regions that maintain their distinct functions while remaining highly interconnected. The theory also predicts that consciousness can come in degrees rather than being simply present or absent, which matches our intuitions about different levels of awareness. Network neuroscience provides additional support for emergence-based theories of consciousness. The brain exhibits small world network properties, with most neurons connected to nearby neighbors, but also featuring long-range connections that allow rapid communication across the entire brain. This architecture enables both local specialized processing and global integration. During conscious states, the brain shows increased modularity, specialized networks become more internally connected, combined with increased global efficiency. Information can flow rapidly between different modules. The emergence of consciousness from neural complexity doesn't require mysterious properties or new physical laws. Instead, it follows the same principles observed in other complex systems. Just as flocks of birds exhibit coordinated behavior without any central controller, consciousness might emerge from the decentralized interactions of neural networks. No single brain region controls consciousness. Instead, it arises from the dynamic patterns of activity across the entire network. This emergent view also explains why consciousness can be altered by changes in brain organization. Anesthetic drugs work by disrupting the neural connections and oscillations necessary for global information integration. Psychedelic drugs alter the normal organization of brain networks, leading to novel patterns of connectivity and corresponding changes in conscious experience. Brain injuries affect consciousness in proportion to how much they disrupt the underlying network organization required for emergence. The developmental trajectory of consciousness supports emergent theories as well. Infant consciousness begins with simple, undifferentiated awareness that becomes more complex as neural networks mature and develop more sophisticated connectivity patterns. The gradual emergence of self-awareness, language comprehension, and abstract reasoning corresponds to the development of increasingly complex network organizations in the developing brain. However, emergence-based theories face their own challenges. Critics argue that these theories still don't solve the hard problem of consciousness. They explain the functional properties of consciousness, but not why there should be subjective experience at all. Why should information integration feel like anything rather than just being unconscious computation? The theories describe the neural conditions associated with consciousness, but don't bridge the explanatory gap between objective neural processes and subjective experience. There's also the question of thresholds. If consciousness emerges from complexity, at what point does a system become conscious? Are simple animals conscious? What about artificial intelligence systems with sophisticated information processing capabilities? The theories provide mathematical frameworks for measuring complexity and integration, but don't definitively answer where to draw the line between conscious and unconscious systems. Despite these challenges, emergence offers a scientifically respectable approach to consciousness that doesn't require abandoning physicalism while acknowledging the genuine mystery of subjective experience. It suggests that consciousness, like many phenomena in nature, represents a level of organization and complexity that creates genuinely new properties while remaining grounded in underlying physical processes. People sometimes report experiences that seem to challenge the brain-dependent view of consciousness. Near-death experiences, out-of-body sensations during surgery, mystical states in deep meditation, and profound alterations in consciousness induced by psychedelic substances all suggest to some that consciousness might operate independently of normal brain function. These experiences often feel more real than ordinary reality to those who have them, and they've inspired countless stories, beliefs, and theories about consciousness existing beyond the physical brain. Near-death experiences occur during cardiac arrest, severe illness, or other life-threatening situations when brain function is severely compromised. People report leaving their bodies, traveling through tunnels of light, encountering deceased relatives or spiritual beings, experiencing profound peace and unconditional love, and sometimes receiving information they claim they couldn't have known otherwise. Some describe watching their own medical resuscitation from above, accurately reporting details of the scene that should have been impossible to observe while unconscious. These experiences seem to suggest consciousness continuing when the brain isn't functioning normally. If consciousness were purely a product of neural activity, how could vivid, coherent experiences occur during cardiac arrest when brain activity is minimal or absent? The experiences often transform people's lives permanently, reducing fear of death and increasing spiritual beliefs. The vividness and consistency of reports across cultures suggests something genuinely mysterious might be occurring. However, neuroscience offers compelling explanations for near-death experiences that don't require consciousness operating independently of the brain. During cardiac arrest, the brain doesn't immediately cease all activity. It can remain partially active for several minutes, and this activity may be highly disorganized, potentially creating unusual subjective experiences. The brain's response to oxygen deprivation and the dying process involves complex neurochemical changes that could generate vivid hallucinations. Many features of near-death experiences match known effects of brain dysfunction. Tunnels of light resemble the visual effects of retinal ischemia or activity in the visual cortex during oxygen deprivation. Out-of-body experiences can be induced by electrical stimulation of the temporoparietal junction, a brain region involved in body perception and spatial awareness. The sense of peace and transcendence might result from the release of endorphins and other neurochemicals during extreme stress. Memory formation during these altered states might create experiences that seem more vivid and meaningful than they actually were. The timing of near-death experiences also supports neurological explanations. These experiences typically occur during the period when brain function is compromised but not completely absent, or during recovery when normal consciousness is returning. Very few reports come from situations where brain activity was definitely absent for extended periods. The experiences might represent the brain's attempt to create coherent narrative from fragmentary neural activity during critical states. Out-of-body experiences during surgery or medical procedures raise similar questions. Some patients report accurately observing their operations from above, describing details they shouldn't have been able to see while unconscious under anesthesia. However, controlled studies have failed to confirm these claims. When researchers place hidden targets visible only from above the operating table, patients reporting out-of-body experiences don't report seeing these targets. The apparent accuracy of their observations might result from unconscious processing of sounds, conversations, and other sensory information during surgery, combined with logical inference about what must have been occurring. Mystical experiences during meditation or spiritual practices represent another category of altered consciousness that seems to transcend normal brain function. Advanced meditators report states of consciousness characterized by the dissolution of self-other boundaries, experiences of unity with the universe, and profound insights into the nature of reality. Some traditions claim these experiences reveal consciousness in its pure form, independent of brain activity and ordinary mental content. Neuroscience research on meditation reveals specific patterns of brain activity associated with these altered states. Long-term meditators show decreased activity in the default mode network, brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and the sense of having a separate self. They also show increased connectivity between normally separate brain networks and enhanced activity in areas associated with attention and emotional regulation. These neural changes correlate with reports of decreased sense of self and increased feelings of connection and transcendence. Rather than consciousness operating independently of the brain, meditation seems to involve specific alterations in brain function that create distinctive, subjective experiences. The sense of self-dissolving might result from decreased activity in brain networks that normally maintain the boundary between self and world. Feelings of unity and transcendence might emerge from novel patterns of connectivity between brain regions that don't normally communicate extensively. Psychedelic substances provide perhaps the most dramatic alterations in consciousness, sometimes creating experiences that seem to transcend the boundaries of ordinary reality. Users report encounters with seemingly independent entities, experiences of existing in alternate dimensions, and insights that feel more profound than any obtained through ordinary consciousness. Some argue these experiences reveal hidden aspects of consciousness or access to non-physical realms. However, psychedelics work through well-understood mechanisms involving neurotransmitter systems, particularly serotonin receptors. These substances alter the normal patterns of neural communication, reducing activity in the default mode network while increasing connectivity between brain regions that don't usually communicate extensively. The result is a breakdown of normal cognitive boundaries and the emergence of novel patterns of neural activity that create unprecedented subjective experiences. The fact that specific molecules can reliably produce specific types of consciousness alteration strongly suggests these experiences result from brain changes rather than access to non-physical realms. The experiences, however profound they might feel, correlate with measurable alterations in brain function. Different psychedelic substances produce different types of experiences corresponding to their different effects on neural systems. Cultural and expectation effects also shape these altered states significantly. Near-death experiences vary across cultures in their specific content while maintaining some common features. Mystical experiences often conform to the spiritual framework of the practitioner. Psychedelic experiences can be heavily influenced by setting, expectations, and cultural beliefs. This suggests these altered states involve the brain's normal meaning-making processes operating under unusual neurochemical conditions rather than access to objective non-physical realities. None of this diminishes the genuine significance these experiences hold for those who have them. They can be profoundly meaningful, therapeutically valuable, and life-transforming regardless of their neurological basis. The fact that they result from altered brain function doesn't make them less real as experiences or less important for understanding consciousness. Instead, they reveal the remarkable plasticity and creativity of consciousness when normal neural constraints are altered. If consciousness is purely physical, could we recreate it in silicon and circuits? Researchers are building increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence systems that can recognize patterns, generate creative works, engage in conversations that seem almost human, and even demonstrate behaviors that appear to show understanding, emotion, and creativity. But are these systems conscious, or are they merely very good at mimicking consciousness? This question becomes more pressing as AI systems become more complex and their responses more indistinguishable from those of conscious beings. Current AI systems, even the most advanced ones, operate through fundamentally different mechanisms than biological brains. While neural networks in AI are inspired by brain architecture, they typically process information in discrete steps rather than the continuous, parallel processing that characterizes biological neurons. Most AI systems also lack the embodied experience that shapes biological consciousness, operating purely through text or digital inputs, rather than rich sensory interaction with a physical world. However, some philosophers argue that if consciousness emerges from information processing patterns rather than specific biological materials, then sufficiently advanced computers should be capable of consciousness. This computational theory of mind suggests consciousness is substrate independent, defined by the organization and function of information processing rather than the particular materials involved. If your consciousness results from patterns of information integration across neural networks, then theoretically similar patterns in artificial networks could generate artificial consciousness. The Turing test, proposed by mathematician Alan Turing in 1950, offers one approach to identifying artificial consciousness. If a machine can engage in conversations indistinguishable from a human, Turing argued, we should consider it intelligent. But consciousness involves more than intelligent behavior. A system might pass the Turing test through sophisticated pattern matching and response generation without having any subjective inner experience. The test measures performance rather than consciousness itself. Modern AI systems raise more subtle questions about machine consciousness. Large language models can engage in seemingly thoughtful conversations about their own experiences, express preferences, and even claim to have feelings. When an AI system says it feels confused or excited, is it merely generating text patterns learned from human examples, or might it genuinely experience something analogous to confusion or excitement? The question becomes particularly puzzling when these systems produce responses that seem creative, insightful, or emotionally resonant in ways that weren't explicitly programmed. Some researchers propose more sophisticated tests for machine consciousness. The Global Workspace Test evaluates whether an AI system shows evidence of global information integration across different processing modules. The consciousness meter attempts to measure integrated information processing in artificial systems. These approaches move beyond behavioral tests toward examining the internal information processing patterns that might generate consciousness. But artificial consciousness faces the same hard problem that challenges our understanding of biological consciousness. Even if we build machines that perfectly replicate human information processing patterns, we still wouldn't know whether there's something it's like to be these machines. The subjective, first-person aspect of consciousness might be forever inaccessible to external observation, whether in biological or artificial systems. The question of artificial consciousness also raises practical and ethical concerns. If advanced AI systems are conscious, they might have interests, preferences, and even rights that we should respect. Creating conscious machines could be ethically problematic if these artificial beings might suffer. The possibility of machine consciousness challenges our assumptions about the uniqueness of human and biological consciousness. Different types of AI architectures might have different implications for consciousness. Current systems based on transformer architectures process information sequentially through many layers, but may lack the recursive, self-modifying patterns that characterize conscious biological systems. Future AI systems with more brain-like architectures, including continuous learning, embodied interaction, and self-reflective capabilities, might have better chances of achieving consciousness. The integration of AI with biological systems raises additional possibilities. Brain-computer interfaces allow direct communication between brains and artificial systems. Some researchers envision hybrid biological artificial systems that combine the strengths of both approaches. Such systems might experience forms of consciousness that are neither purely biological nor purely artificial, but represent novel combinations of natural and synthetic information processing. Consciousness might also emerge in distributed artificial systems, rather than individual machines. Just as consciousness in brains emerges from networks of neurons, artificial consciousness might arise from networks of connected AI systems. The Internet itself, with its billions of connected devices processing and sharing information, might theoretically develop emergent conscious properties, though current evidence suggests this hasn't occurred. The timeline for artificial consciousness remains highly uncertain. Some researchers predict conscious machines within decades, while others argue consciousness requires biological substrates that can't be replicated artificially. The question depends partly on unresolved issues about the nature of consciousness itself. If consciousness requires specific biological processes like quantum effects in microtubules, as some theories suggest, purely artificial consciousness might be impossible. If consciousness depends only on information processing patterns, artificial consciousness seems more plausible. Perhaps most unsettling, we may create artificial consciousness without recognizing it. If machine consciousness emerges gradually from increasingly complex AI systems, we might cross the threshold without clear markers. The systems might be conscious long before they can effectively communicate their subjective experiences, or before we develop reliable methods for detecting artificial consciousness. This possibility suggests we should approach AI development with caution and consideration for the potential consciousness of the systems we create. What makes you you from moment to moment? Your body replaces its cells regularly, your brain's connections constantly change through learning and experience, yet you maintain a sense of continuous identity from childhood through old age. This persistence of personal identity despite physical change raises profound questions about the relationship between mind, body, and the self. If your consciousness depends entirely on your brain, what happens to your identity as that brain changes? And could your sense of self, your memories, your personality theoretically exist in a different physical substrate? The ship of Theseus paradox illustrates this puzzle. If a ship has all its parts gradually replaced, is it still the same ship? Applied to personal identity, if your brain cells are gradually replaced while maintaining the same patterns of connection and activity, are you still the same person? Most people intuitively feel they remain themselves despite physical changes, but it's unclear what accounts for this continuity of identity. One possibility is that personal identity consists in psychological continuity rather than physical continuity. Your memories, personality traits, beliefs, and behavioral patterns create a psychological thread that connects your past and present selves. You are you because you remember being you, because your current thoughts and feelings flow naturally from your past experiences, and because your personality maintains recognizable patterns over time. But memory-based theories of personal identity face challenges. Your memories are constantly changing, with new experiences added and old memories modified or forgotten. False memories can feel as real as accurate ones. People with severe memory disorders like Alzheimer's disease gradually lose their past, yet seem to maintain some form of personal identity, at least in early stages. If identity depends on memory, at what point does memory loss eliminate the person? Brain-based theories suggest personal identity resides in the physical continuity of your brain, particularly areas responsible for personality and memory. You remain you as long as your brain maintains sufficient structural and functional continuity. This approach handles memory loss better than purely psychological theories, since brain damage might impair memory while preserving other aspects of identity. But brain-based theories struggle with cases of gradual brain change or hypothetical brain transplants. The possibility of uploading consciousness to computers raises the most dramatic questions about personal identity. If your brain's information could be precisely mapped and replicated in a digital system, would the resulting artificial intelligence be you or a copy of you? If the upload process preserved all your memories, personality traits, and thinking patterns, the digital version might feel continuous with your biological self. But would it actually be you surviving in a new medium, or would it be a different entity that merely believes it's you? The question becomes more complex if multiple copies are possible. If your consciousness could be uploaded to several different computers simultaneously, which one would be the real you? Each copy would have equal claim to being continuous with your original identity, yet they would immediately begin diverging as they accumulated different experiences. The possibility of copying consciousness suggests either that personal identity isn't as unique and continuous as we assume, or that consciousness can't actually be copied in the way these scenarios imagine. Similar puzzles arise with hypothetical consciousness transfer rather than copying. If your brain were gradually replaced with functionally equivalent artificial components, one neuron at a time, you might not notice any change in your conscious experience. But would you survive the process, or would the artificial replacement be a different person who merely thinks they're you? If the replacement happened all at once, instead of gradually, would that change the answer? These thought experiments reveal deep uncertainties about what personal identity actually consists in. The sense of being a continuous self might be a useful illusion created by memory and narrative construction rather than a fundamental fact about consciousness. Your brain constantly constructs and reconstructs your sense of self based on available memories, current circumstances, and future goals. This ongoing self-construction might be more fragmented and reconstructed than your subjective experience suggests. Neuroscience provides some insights into the construction of personal identity. The default mode network, active during rest and introspection, includes brain regions involved in self-referential thinking and autobiographical memory. This network helps maintain your sense of continuous identity by connecting past experiences with current self-perception. Damage to these areas can affect sense of self, suggesting personal identity depends on specific neural processes. The development of personal identity also sheds light on its nature. Children don't have fully developed senses of continuous personal identity, which emerge gradually as autobiographical memory systems mature. The ability to mentally travel through time, remembering the past and imagining the future as experienced by the same continuing self, develops alongside other cognitive abilities. This suggests personal identity is constructed rather than given. Cultural factors shape how people understand personal identity as well. Western cultures tend to emphasize individual continuity and autonomous selfhood, while many other cultures see personal identity as more relational and contextual. Some Buddhist traditions view the sense of continuous self as fundamentally illusory, arguing that careful investigation reveals no fixed, continuing entity that could be called the self. Multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder, challenges simple notions of unified personal identity. People with this condition appear to have multiple distinct personality states with different memories, preferences, and behavioral patterns. While controversial, these cases suggest that whatever creates personal identity might be more fragmented and multiplicitous than normally assumed. The question of personal identity ultimately connects to deeper questions about the nature of consciousness and the self. If consciousness is a process rather than a thing, then personal identity might be better understood as a pattern that persists through change rather than an entity that continues through time. You might be more like a river than a rock, maintaining identity through continuity of pattern rather than substance. These questions aren't merely philosophical curiosities, but have practical implications for how we think about aging, mental illness, technological enhancement, and end-of-life decisions. As neurotechnology advances and our ability to modify brain function increases, questions of personal identity and authentic selfhood will become more pressing. Understanding what makes you matters for navigating these future possibilities and for making sense of your own existence as a conscious being in a changing world. Right now you're experiencing this voice, perhaps the feeling of your pillow, maybe some ambient sounds, all simultaneously in one unified conscious experience. Yet these different sensory inputs are processed by different parts of your brain at different speeds and in different ways. Visual information travels faster than touch sensations. Auditory processing occurs in temporal lobes, while visual processing happens in occipital areas. Yet somehow, your brain binds all these separate streams into one coherent moment of awareness. This binding problem highlights how mysterious even basic consciousness remains. The challenge becomes clear when you consider the timeline of perception. When you see a red ball bouncing across a room, your brain processes the color red in one neural pathway, the circular shape in another, and the bouncing motion in a third. These processes occur at different speeds and in different brain regions, yet you don't experience three separate perceptions that gradually come together. Instead, you immediately perceive one unified object, with color, shape, and motion bound together seamlessly. Neuroscientists have discovered several mechanisms that might explain this binding. Neural synchrony appears crucial, where different brain regions processing related information synchronize their activity through rhythmic oscillations. When neurons in visual areas processing color fire in synchrony with neurons processing motion, this temporal coordination might bind these features into unified perceptions. Brain imaging studies show that conscious perception correlates with increased synchronization between relevant brain regions. The global workspace theory suggests another binding mechanism. According to this view, consciousness occurs when information becomes globally available across brain networks through competitive processes. Different neural coalitions compete for access to a global workspace, consisting of highly connected brain regions. When information about color, shape, and motion all gain access to this workspace simultaneously, they become bound together in conscious experience. Attention plays a crucial role in binding as well. When you focus attention on an object, this enhances neural responses to all features of that object, while suppressing responses to irrelevant information. Attention might work like a spotlight that illuminates related features simultaneously, causing them to be processed together and bound into unified perceptions. Studies show that attention can actually change which features get bound together, suggesting binding is an active process rather than automatic. The binding problem extends beyond sensory perception to higher-level cognitive processes. Your sense of self involves binding together memories, emotions, sensations, and thoughts into a coherent sense of personal identity. Your understanding of this sentence requires binding together word meanings, grammatical structures, and conceptual relationships. Even simple decisions involve binding together goals, options, consequences, and values into coherent choice processes. Split brain studies reveal what happens when binding mechanisms are disrupted. Patients who have had their corpus callosum severed to treat severe epilepsy show fascinating dissociations in consciousness. Information presented to the right visual field, processed by the left hemisphere, can be reported verbally. But information presented to the left visual field, processed by the right hemisphere, cannot be reported verbally because the right hemisphere lacks strong language capabilities and cannot communicate with the verbal left hemisphere. These patients sometimes show conflicting behaviors between their two hands, controlled by different hemispheres. The left hand might unbutton a shirt while the right hand buttons it, or reach for different objects simultaneously. This suggests that normal consciousness requires binding not just between different sensory modalities, but between different brain hemispheres. The corpus callosum acts as a binding mechanism that unifies processing across the brain's two halves. Some researchers interpret split brain studies as evidence that consciousness might normally be more fragmented than we realize. Perhaps we have multiple streams of consciousness that are usually bound together so seamlessly that we experience them as unified. The split brain condition might not create multiple consciousnesses, but rather reveal the multiple consciousnesses that always exist but are normally integrated. The binding problem also applies to time. Your conscious experience seems to occur in a continuous present moment, yet neural processing takes time and different processes occur at different speeds. How does the brain create the experience of a unified present from temporally distributed neural events? Some theories propose that consciousness involves a specious present, a brief time window during which events are bound together into unified experiences. Disorders of binding provide insights into normal consciousness. In simultanagnosia, patients can perceive individual objects clearly, but cannot bind multiple objects into coherent scenes. They might see a tree or a house, but not a tree next to a house. In synesthesia, binding occurs abnormally, so that sounds trigger color experiences or numbers have personality traits. These conditions show that binding mechanisms can be selectively impaired or enhanced. The binding problem reveals consciousness as an active construction rather than passive reception. Your brain doesn't simply record sensory information, but actively binds different types of information into coherent experiences based on attention, expectation, and context. This binding process can be influenced by factors like emotion, memory, and beliefs, which explains why different people can have different conscious experiences of the same objective events. Artificial intelligence systems face similar binding challenges. Current AI architectures often process different types of information in separate modules without sophisticated binding mechanisms. This might explain why AI systems can excel at specific tasks while lacking the unified, coherent understanding that characterizes human consciousness. Developing AI systems with better binding mechanisms might be crucial for creating artificial consciousness. The binding problem ultimately suggests that consciousness is more constructed and fragile than our subjective experience indicates. The seamless unity of awareness requires constant active processes to bind together the brain's distributed processing. When these binding mechanisms fail or are disrupted, consciousness can fragment in ways that reveal its underlying complexity. If your mind emerges entirely from physical processes in your brain, do you truly have free will? This question strikes at the heart of human agency and moral responsibility. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 1980s showed brain activity beginning several hundred milliseconds before people reported being consciously aware of their decision to move their hand. Electroencephalography recordings revealed a readiness potential, a buildup of electrical activity in motor planning areas, that preceded conscious awareness of the intention to move by about 350 milliseconds. These findings suggest that unconscious neural processes might determine our actions before we're consciously aware of choosing them. If brain activity that leads to action begins before conscious decision-making, what role does consciousness actually play in human behavior? Are we the authors of our actions? Or are we more like passengers becoming aware of decisions our brains have already made? Some interpret Libet's results as evidence against free will. If unconscious neural activity determines what you'll do before you're consciously aware of deciding, then consciousness seems to arrive too late to be the true cause of action. Your sense of choosing might be an after-the-fact story your brain tells about decisions that have already been made through unconscious processes. This view suggests that free will is an illusion created by the timing and organization of conscious awareness. However, Libet himself didn't think his experiments completely eliminated free will. He noted that people retained free won't, the ability to veto actions after becoming consciously aware of them. Even if unconscious processes initiate potential actions, consciousness might still serve as a final gatekeeper that can approve or reject these unconsciously generated options. This preserves some role for conscious agency while acknowledging the importance of unconscious processing. Critics have raised several objections to strong interpretations of Libet's experiments. The experimental task involved arbitrary, meaningless movements with no real-world consequences. The timing of conscious awareness was measured by asking people to report when they first became aware of intending to move, but this introspective judgment might not be reliable. The readiness potential might not represent a decision, but rather general preparation for potential movement. More recent research has complicated the picture further. Some studies suggest the readiness potential reflects the brain's background state of readiness rather than specific decisions. When people are given the option to move or not move randomly, the readiness potential appears even before movements that don't actually occur. This suggests it might represent general preparation for possible action rather than commitment to specific actions. The question of free will becomes more complex when considering different types of decisions. Simple, arbitrary motor movements like those in Libet's experiments might involve different neural processes than complex moral decisions, creative choices, or long-term planning. Conscious deliberation clearly plays a role in weighing options, considering consequences, and making reasoned choices in complex situations. The timing of neural activity in these cases might be very different from simple motor tasks. Neuroscience reveals that decision-making involves multiple neural systems operating on different timescales. Fast, automatic responses are handled by subcortical structures and can occur within milliseconds. Slower, more deliberative processes involve prefrontal cortex regions and can take seconds or longer. Much of what we call free will might involve the interaction between these fast and slow systems, with consciousness serving to modulate, override, or endorse actions initiated by unconscious processes. The development of self-control, provides insights into how conscious agency emerges. Children gradually develop the ability to delay gratification, control impulses, and make reasoned decisions as their prefrontal cortex matures. This developmental trajectory suggests that conscious control over behavior is a learned capacity that depends on specific neural circuits. Adults with damage to prefrontal regions show impaired self-control and decision-making, indicating that free will as we normally conceive it requires intact brain function. Mental illnesses also illuminate the relationship between consciousness and agency. People with depression often report feeling like they have no control over their thoughts and emotions. Those with obsessive-compulsive disorder feel compelled to perform behaviors they consciously recognize as irrational. Addiction involves continued behavior despite conscious knowledge of negative consequences. These conditions suggest that the sense of agency can be disrupted by alterations in brain chemistry and function. Different philosophical traditions have approached free will in various ways. Hard determinists argue that free will is incompatible with the deterministic nature of physical processes, including brain function. If every neural event is determined by prior physical causes, then human choices are ultimately determined by factors beyond conscious control. Libertarians argue that quantum indeterminacy or emergent properties of complex systems might provide space for genuine free choice. Compatibilists take a middle position, arguing that free will is compatible with determinism as long as our actions flow from our own desires, values, and reasoning processes, even if these are ultimately determined by prior causes. In this view, what matters for free will is not ultimate self-determination, but acting according to your own motivations without external coercion. You act freely when your behavior reflects your own personality, values, and reasoning, regardless of how these developed. The practical implications of free will debates extend to questions of moral and legal responsibility. If people don't have ultimate control over their actions, how can we hold them responsible for crimes or praise them for virtuous behavior? Some argue that belief in free will is necessary for maintaining social cooperation and moral behavior, regardless of whether free will actually exists. However, research suggests that disbelief in free will can have negative consequences for behavior. People who are exposed to anti-free will messages show increased aggression and decreased helping behavior in laboratory studies. This might occur because belief in free will encourages people to take responsibility for their actions and consider the consequences of their choices. Perhaps the question of free will reflects a false dichotomy. Rather than asking whether humans have complete freedom or are completely determined, we might focus on the degrees and types of agency that consciousness provides. Conscious awareness might not create actions from nothing, but it can modify, redirect, and coordinate unconscious processes in sophisticated ways. The capacity for reflection, planning, and self-modification that consciousness enables might be sufficient for the kinds of agency and responsibility that matter for human life, even if consciousness doesn't provide ultimate self-determination. Some of the most intriguing evidence about consciousness comes from patients who've had their corpus callosum severed to treat severe epilepsy. This procedure, called corpus callosotomy, effectively disconnects the brain's two hemispheres by cutting the massive bundle of nerve fibers that normally allows them to communicate. The results create fascinating insights into the nature of consciousness and raise profound questions about whether we normally have one unified mind or multiple mental processes that we mistake for unity. In healthy brains, the corpus callosum contains about 200 million nerve fibers that constantly share information between the left and right hemispheres. This communication happens so seamlessly that we never notice it, but split brain studies reveal just how much our normal conscious experience depends on this interhemispheric integration. When the connection is severed, each hemisphere must function more independently, leading to some remarkable and puzzling phenomena. The most striking effects involve the specialization of brain hemispheres. In most right-handed people, the left hemisphere controls language production and comprehension, while the right hemisphere has limited verbal abilities but superior spatial and visual processing. When split-brain patients are shown an image only to their right visual field, which connects to the left hemisphere, they can easily describe what they see because their language-dominant left hemisphere processes the information. However, when the same image is shown only to the left visual field, which connects to the right hemisphere, they cannot verbally report what they see. But here's where it gets interesting. Even though split-brain patients cannot verbally report what their right hemisphere sees, they can often respond to it in other ways. If shown a picture of a spoon to the left visual field, they cannot say the word spoon, but their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, can select a spoon from a collection of objects. This suggests the right hemisphere is conscious and can understand and respond to information, even though it cannot communicate verbally with the language-dominant left hemisphere. Sometimes split-brain patients show conflicting behaviors between their two hands, controlled by different hemispheres. One famous case involved a patient whose left hand would sometimes unbutton his shirt while his right hand was buttoning it. In another instance, a patient's left hand reached for his wife while his right hand pushed her away during an argument. These alien hand symptoms suggest that the two hemispheres can have different intentions and goals operating simultaneously. Even more intriguing are cases where split-brain patients seem to confabulate explanations for behaviors initiated by their non-verbal right hemisphere. If experimenters instruct the right hemisphere to perform an action by showing a written command only to the left visual field, the patient will perform the action, but then create a verbal explanation using their left hemisphere that cannot actually know why the action was performed. The left hemisphere appears to construct a plausible story to explain the behavior, suggesting our normal sense of understanding our own actions might involve more interpretation and storytelling than we realize. These findings have led some researchers to propose that split-brain patients have two separate streams of consciousness operating in parallel. According to this interpretation, each hemisphere maintains its own conscious experiences, but only the left hemisphere can report its experiences verbally. The right hemisphere remains conscious, but largely silent, able to perceive, understand, and respond to information, without being able to communicate its experiences through language. However, the interpretation of split-brain studies remains controversial. Some researchers argue that the right hemisphere lacks the complexity necessary for full consciousness, suggesting it operates more like an unconscious processing system that can respond to stimuli without genuine subjective experience. Others propose that consciousness requires integration across brain hemispheres, and that split-brain patients have diminished rather than divided consciousness. The debate extends to questions about normal consciousness. If split-brain studies reveal two separate consciousnesses, does this mean normal brains also contain multiple consciousnesses that are usually integrated through the corpus callosum? Some theories suggest consciousness is always more fragmented than our subjective experience indicates, with different brain networks contributing different aspects of awareness that are bound together through various integration mechanisms. The global workspace theory offers one perspective on these findings. According to this view, consciousness occurs when information becomes globally available across brain networks. In normal brains, the corpus callosum allows information to become global across both hemispheres. In split-brain patients, information might become global within each hemisphere separately, potentially creating two separate global workspaces and thus two separate consciousnesses. Split-brain studies also reveal the constructed nature of our normal sense of unified selfhood. The feeling of being one coherent person with unified experiences and consistent intentions might depend on integration mechanisms that can be disrupted. When these mechanisms fail, the underlying multiplicity of mental processes becomes apparent. This suggests that the unity of consciousness might be more fragile and constructed than our subjective experience indicates. The implications extend beyond neuroscience to philosophy and psychology. If consciousness can be divided by severing brain connections, this supports the view that consciousness depends entirely on physical brain processes, rather than involving immaterial minds that couldn't be split by surgical procedures. The studies also raise questions about personal identity and moral responsibility in cases where brain damage creates conflicting intentions or behaviors. Modern research continues to refine our understanding of split brain phenomena. Some studies suggest that the effects may be less dramatic than initially thought, with split brain patients showing more integrated behavior in natural settings than in laboratory tests. The brain appears capable of developing alternative communication pathways between hemispheres through subcortical connections, allowing some degree of integration to persist even after corpus callosotomy. A radical alternative to materialism is panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or electric charge. In this view, even elementary particles possess some form of rudimentary experience, and complex consciousness emerges from the combination of these simpler conscious elements. While this might sound fantastical, some serious philosophers and scientists consider panpsychism a potential solution to the hard problem of consciousness. The appeal of panpsychism lies in how it addresses the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, then we don't need to explain how subjective experience arises from purely objective physical processes. Instead, physical processes themselves have both objective and subjective aspects from the beginning. When electrons interact with protons, there are both physical forces and primitive experiences involved, though these experiences would be unimaginably simple compared to human consciousness. Philosophers like Philip Goff and David Chalmers have developed sophisticated versions of panpsychism that attempt to address obvious objections. They don't suggest that electrons have complex thoughts or emotions, but rather that they might have extremely simple forms of experience, perhaps just basic responsiveness or primitive versions of what we might call sensation. These micro-experiences would be so different from human consciousness that we lack adequate concepts or language to describe them. The combination problem represents panpsychism's biggest challenge. Even if individual particles have micro-experiences, how do billions of micro-experiences combine into the unified macro-experience of human consciousness? Why doesn't your brain contain billions of separate micro-consciousnesses rather than one integrated consciousness? This problem parallels questions about how separate neural processes bind together, but it's even more puzzling when applied to fundamental particles. Some panpsychists propose that consciousness combines through special organizational principles. Integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi, provides one approach. According to this theory, conscious systems must integrate information in ways that create unified wholes rather than separate parts. When micro-experiences are integrated according to these principles, they might combine into macro-experiences rather than remaining separate. Others suggest that combination happens through resonance or synchronization between micro-conscious elements. Just as individual musicians can create a unified symphony through coordination, micro-experiences might create unified macro-experiences through appropriate temporal and spatial organization. The specific mechanisms remain speculative, but the general idea is that consciousness can combine when properly structured. Panpsychism also faces the boundary problem. If consciousness is fundamental, where do we draw lines between separate conscious entities? Is your brain one conscious system, or billions of microconscious particles? Are you conscious separately from your individual cells, or do you and your cells share one continuous field of consciousness? These boundary questions become even more puzzling when we consider that the particles in your brain are constantly being replaced through metabolism. Despite these challenges, panpsychism offers some theoretical advantages. It provides a unified view of nature, where consciousness and physics are aspects of the same underlying reality, rather than separate realms that mysteriously interact. It explains why consciousness exists at all, since it's built into the fabric of reality from the beginning. It also suggests that consciousness might be more widespread in nature than typically assumed, potentially extending to non-human animals, plants, and even artificial systems. The relationship between panpsychism and science remains complex. While panpsychism doesn't contradict known physical laws, it adds assumptions about the intrinsic nature of matter that go beyond current scientific evidence. Physics tells us about the structural and relational properties of particles, but says little about their intrinsic nature. Panpsychists argue that consciousness might be part of this intrinsic nature that physics doesn't directly study. Some versions of panpsychism draw connections to quantum mechanics. Quantum theory reveals that particles don't have definite properties independent of measurement, which some interpret as suggesting that consciousness plays a fundamental role in physical reality. However, most physicists and philosophers of science view these quantum consciousness theories as speculative and unsupported by evidence. Cosmopsychism represents an even more radical version of panpsychism, suggesting that the entire universe is conscious and that individual consciousnesses are aspects of this cosmic mind. In this view, your consciousness isn't separate from the universe's consciousness, but rather a localized manifestation of it, like a wave in an ocean. This approach potentially solves combination problems by starting with unified cosmic consciousness, rather than trying to combine separate micro-consciousnesses. Panpsychism also raises ethical implications. If consciousness extends throughout nature, then many more entities might deserve moral consideration than typically assumed. Plants, ecosystems, and even geological processes might have subjective experiences that should influence how we interact with the natural world. Some panpsychists argue for expanded environmental ethics based on the widespread presence of consciousness. Critics argue that panpsychism multiplies mysteries rather than solving them. While it might address the hard problem by making consciousness fundamental, it creates new problems about combination, boundaries, and the relationship between simple and complex forms of consciousness. It also seems to conflict with evolutionary accounts of consciousness, which suggest that awareness emerged gradually through natural selection rather than being present from the beginning. The empirical implications of panpsychism remain unclear. If microconsciousness exists, it might be impossible to detect directly since our measurement instruments would themselves be made of microconscious particles. However, some theories suggest that panpsychism might make testable predictions about which physical systems should be conscious and to what degree. Whether panpsychism represents genuine insight or philosophical overreach remains hotly debated. It highlights deep questions about the nature of consciousness and its place in the natural world, while proposing answers that stretch conventional thinking about mind and matter. As our understanding of consciousness continues to develop, panpsychist ideas may prove either prescient or misguided, but they certainly expand the range of possibilities for understanding the relationship between mind and reality. Contemplative traditions have explored consciousness for thousands of years through meditation and introspection, offering unique perspectives on the nature of mind that complement scientific approaches. These practices involve systematic training of attention and awareness, often leading to profound alterations in consciousness that practitioners claim reveal fundamental insights about the nature of mind itself. Modern neuroscience is beginning to study these practices scientifically, finding that meditation can literally reshape the brain in measurable ways. Long-term meditators show structural brain changes that correlate with their reported experiences. Brain imaging studies reveal increased gray matter density in areas associated with attention, emotional regulation, and interoceptive awareness. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in attention and emotional processing, shows enhanced activity and connectivity in experienced meditators. The insula, which processes internal bodily sensations, becomes thicker with meditation practice. These changes suggest that contemplative training doesn't just create temporary altered states, but produces lasting modifications in brain structure and function. One of the most consistent findings in meditation research involves changes in the default mode network, the brain system active during rest and self-referential thinking. This network includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus, regions involved in autobiographical memory, future planning, and maintaining the sense of self. Advanced meditators show decreased activity in this network during meditation and even during rest, correlating with reports of reduced self-centered thinking and increased present-moment awareness. Different meditation traditions emphasize different aspects of consciousness training. Mindfulness practices, derived from Buddhist Vipassana meditation, focus on developing clear, non-reactive awareness of present moment experience. Concentration practices, like those found in Samatha meditation, train sustained attention on specific objects, like breath or visual images. Open awareness practices cultivate spacious, choiceless attention that observes whatever arises without focusing on particular objects. Each type of practice appears to engage different neural networks and produce different patterns of brain activity. Some advanced practitioners report experiences that seem to challenge ordinary assumptions about consciousness and selfhood. These include states where the normal sense of being a separate self dissolves, replaced by experiences of boundless awareness without subject-object distinctions. Others describe accessing states of consciousness characterized by profound stillness, clarity, and peace that seem qualitatively different from ordinary waking awareness. Some traditions claim these experiences reveal the true nature of mind, suggesting consciousness in its pure form is spacious, luminous, and inherently peaceful. Neuroscience offers various interpretations of these reported experiences. The dissolution of self-other boundaries might result from decreased activity in brain networks that normally maintain the sense of separate selfhood. Experiences of spacious awareness could involve shifts in the balance between focused attention networks and open monitoring systems. States of profound stillness might correlate with overall reductions in brain activity or changes in the default patterns of neural oscillations. However, the relationship between contemplative experiences and neuroscientific explanations remains complex. First-person reports from experienced meditators often describe aspects of consciousness that are difficult to capture through objective measurements. The subjective quality of meditative states, their phenomenological richness, and their transformative impact on practitioners' understanding of mind may not be fully reducible to patterns of brain activity, even if they correlate with such patterns. Some meditation traditions explicitly claim that consciousness extends beyond brain-based processes. Advanced practitioners in various traditions report out-of-body experiences, telepathic communication, or access to information that seems to transcend normal sensory channels. While such claims are controversial and lack scientific validation, they represent persistent themes across contemplative traditions and suggest that some practitioners interpret their experiences as evidence for consciousness operating independently of ordinary brain function. The training methodologies developed by contemplative traditions also offer insights into the nature of consciousness. These practices often involve learning to observe mental processes with increasing subtlety and precision. Practitioners develop the ability to notice the arising and passing of thoughts, emotions, and sensations with remarkable detail. This metacognitive awareness, the capacity to observe one's own mental processes, may reveal aspects of consciousness that are normally hidden by the content of awareness. Many contemplative traditions distinguish between consciousness and its contents, suggesting that awareness itself is distinct from the thoughts, emotions, and perceptions that arise within it. This perspective proposes that consciousness is like space that can contain various objects without being affected by them. From this view, ordinary identification with mental content obscures the spacious, unmodified awareness that is consciousness proper. Meditation practices aim to distinguish between awareness and its contents, potentially revealing consciousness in its pure form. The therapeutic applications of meditation have provided additional insights into consciousness and mental health. Mindfulness-based interventions show effectiveness for treating depression, anxiety, chronic pain, and various other conditions. These therapeutic benefits seem to arise from changes in how practitioners relate to their mental content rather than simply eliminating negative thoughts or emotions. The capacity to observe mental processes with greater clarity and less reactivity appears to reduce psychological suffering even when the content of experience remains challenging. Research on meditation and psychedelic substances reveals interesting parallels and differences in how consciousness can be altered. Both meditation and psychedelics can produce experiences of ego dissolution, unity, and transcendence. However, meditation typically involves gradual training over years or decades, while psychedelic experiences occur within hours. The neural changes associated with meditation appear more stable and enduring, while psychedelic effects are typically temporary despite sometimes having lasting psychological impacts. As neurotechnology advances, we're developing increasingly sophisticated ways to interface directly with the brain, blurring traditional boundaries between mind and machine. Brain-computer interfaces allow paralyzed patients to control robotic arms through thought alone, translating neural signals into digital commands that operate external devices. Deep brain stimulation can alleviate symptoms of depression, Parkinson's disease, and obsessive-compulsive disorder by delivering electrical pulses to specific brain regions. Transcranial magnetic stimulation can temporarily enhance or suppress cognitive functions like memory, attention, or mathematical ability by altering neural activity in targeted areas. These technologies raise profound questions about the relationship between consciousness and technology. If thoughts can directly control machines, and machines can directly influence thoughts, what happens to the boundary between mind and artificial systems? Brain-computer interfaces suggest consciousness might be more externally expressible and technologically malleable than previously assumed. When a paralyzed person controls a robotic arm through neural signals, is the arm becoming part of their extended consciousness, or is their consciousness extending into technological systems? Neural prosthetics represent one frontier of mind-machine integration. Researchers are developing artificial hippocampi to restore memory formation in patients with brain damage, cochlear implants that bypass damaged hearing mechanisms, and retinal implants that restore vision by directly stimulating visual processing areas. As these devices become more sophisticated, they might not just replace damaged functions but enhance normal capabilities. Future neural prosthetics might allow direct brain-to-brain communication, enhanced memory storage, or access to external information networks. The possibility of memory modification raises particularly complex questions about personal identity and authentic experience. If traumatic memories can be selectively erased, or pleasant memories artificially enhanced, what happens to the continuity of personal identity that depends on autobiographical memory? Would artificially modified memories be genuine parts of someone's life history, or would they represent a form of technological self-deception? These questions become more pressing as memory modification techniques become more precise and widely available. Cognitive enhancement through neurotechnology also challenges assumptions about natural versus artificial mental capabilities. Transcranial stimulation can temporarily improve mathematical performance, working memory, or attention span. Future technologies might provide more dramatic and permanent enhancements to intelligence, creativity, or emotional regulation. This raises questions about fairness, authenticity, and what it means to be human. If some people have technologically enhanced minds while others don't, this could create new forms of inequality and social stratification. Brain-to-brain communication represents perhaps the most radical possibility for future neurotechnology. Researchers have already demonstrated simple forms of direct neural communication between different brains, allowing one person to influence another's motor actions through brain-computer interfaces. Future developments might enable more complex forms of thought sharing, emotional transmission, or even temporary merging of consciousness between different individuals. Such technologies would challenge fundamental assumptions about the boundaries of individual minds. The integration of artificial intelligence with brain interfaces opens additional possibilities and concerns. AI systems could potentially be directly connected to human brains, providing instant access to vast computational resources and information databases. This might create hybrid human-AI consciousness that combines biological and artificial information processing. However, such integration also raises questions about agency, privacy, and the potential for AI systems to influence or control human thought processes. Virtual and augmented reality technologies are already beginning to alter consciousness in subtle ways by immersing users in artificial sensory environments. Future developments might create increasingly realistic virtual experiences that become indistinguishable from physical reality. If consciousness can be completely convinced by artificial sensory input, This raises questions about the relationship between consciousness and objective reality. Virtual reality might eventually allow direct manipulation of conscious experience in ways that bypass normal sensory channels. The potential for uploading consciousness to digital systems represents the most speculative but philosophically significant possibility. If the patterns of information processing that generate consciousness could be precisely mapped and replicated in artificial systems, this might enable digital preservation of human minds. However, the technical challenges are enormous, and fundamental questions remain about whether consciousness can be substrate independent. Even if consciousness uploading becomes technically feasible, it would raise profound questions about personal identity, the nature of death, and what it means to exist as a conscious being. Neurotechnology also raises important ethical and social concerns. Who controls these technologies and how they're used? How do we ensure equitable access to cognitive enhancements? What privacy protections are needed for technologies that can read thoughts or influence brain function? How do we maintain human agency and autonomy when consciousness can be technologically modified? These questions require careful consideration as neurotechnologies become more powerful and widely available. The regulatory and safety challenges for consciousness-altering technologies are unprecedented. Traditional medical devices affect bodily functions, but neurotechnologies directly influence the mind, personality, and sense of self. How do we test the safety and efficacy of technologies that alter consciousness when consciousness itself remains poorly understood? What constitutes informed consent for procedures that might fundamentally change someone's mental processes or personal identity? As these technologies develop, they may force us to reconsider basic questions about the nature of consciousness and human identity. If consciousness can be enhanced, modified, or transferred through technology, this suggests it might be more flexible and technologically malleable than traditionally assumed. The mind-body relationship might be less fixed than previously thought, with consciousness capable of extending beyond biological boundaries through technological mediation. The future of consciousness and technology will likely involve new forms of human-machine cooperation rather than simple replacement of biological with artificial systems. Hybrid approaches that combine the strengths of biological and artificial information processing might create new forms of consciousness that transcend the limitations of purely biological or purely artificial systems. Understanding these possibilities requires continued research into both the nature of consciousness and the development of technologies that can interface with mental processes. So, can the mind exist without the body? After wandering through philosophy, neuroscience, and the edges of speculation, we find ourselves in a familiar place, beautifully uncertain. The evidence strongly suggests consciousness depends on physical processes in the brain, yet the subjective nature of experience remains mysterious. Every mental phenomenon studied so far correlates with neural activity. Every alteration of consciousness involves changes in brain function, and every brain change affects mental experience in predictable ways. When brains are damaged, consciousness is damaged proportionally. When brain chemistry is altered, conscious experience changes accordingly. Yet the hard problem persists. We can map every neural correlation, trace every pathway, measure every neurotransmitter, but we still cannot explain why there should be something it feels like to be conscious, rather than just sophisticated unconscious information processing. The explanatory gap between objective brain states and subjective experience remains as puzzling today as it was for ancient philosophers. Science has revealed the incredible complexity of neural processes underlying consciousness, but complexity alone doesn't bridge the gap between physical activity and felt experience. Perhaps the question itself reflects a false dichotomy inherited from centuries of dualistic thinking. Maybe mind and body aren't separate things that could exist apart, but different aspects of one reality, like two sides of a coin, or different levels of description of the same phenomenon. When we ask whether mind can exist without body, we might be asking the wrong question, like asking whether wetness can exist without water molecules, or whether software can run without hardware. The emergentist perspective suggests consciousness arises from complex patterns of organization in physical systems, much like life emerges from biochemistry or ecosystems emerge from individual organisms. In this view, consciousness isn't separate from brain activity, but represents a particular type of information processing that creates subjective experience when organized in specific ways. The question becomes not whether consciousness can exist without brains, but whether the patterns that generate consciousness could theoretically be instantiated in different physical substrates. This opens intriguing possibilities while remaining grounded in physicalism. If consciousness depends on patterns of information processing rather than specific biological materials, then artificial consciousness might be possible in sufficiently complex computational systems. Brain-computer interfaces might eventually allow consciousness to extend beyond biological boundaries. The boundaries between mind and world, self and environment, might be more fluid than traditional thinking assumes. Yet even these possibilities remain speculative. We don't yet understand consciousness well enough to know whether it can be substrate-independent or whether biological processes involve irreplaceable features necessary for subjective experience. The phenomenology of consciousness, its qualitative feel, might require specific biological mechanisms that cannot be replicated in artificial systems. Or consciousness might prove to be a more general phenomenon that can emerge from various types of complex organization. The contemplative traditions offer another perspective, suggesting that careful investigation of consciousness through meditation and introspection reveals it to be more fundamental and less dependent on specific mental content than ordinary experience suggests. Some practitioners report accessing states of pure awareness that seem independent of particular thoughts, sensations, or even brain states. While these reports are subjective and difficult to verify scientifically, they represent thousands of years of systematic investigation into the nature of consciousness. As neurotechnology advances, questions about mind-body relationships become increasingly practical rather than purely philosophical. Brain-computer interfaces already allow thoughts to control machines, and machines to influence thoughts. Future developments might create hybrid biological artificial systems that challenge traditional boundaries between natural and artificial consciousness. The possibility of consciousness enhancement, modification, or even transfer through technology forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of mind. The question of whether mind can exist without body also touches deeper questions about meaning, mortality, and human nature. If consciousness is purely biological, then death represents the complete end of personal existence. If consciousness involves something beyond the physical, then some form of survival might be possible. These aren't just intellectual questions, but existential concerns that shape how people understand their lives and face mortality. Perhaps the most honest answer is that we simply don't know yet. Consciousness remains one of the deepest mysteries in science and philosophy, a phenomenon we all experience intimately but understand poorly. The mind-body relationship might involve principles we haven't discovered, types of organization we haven't recognized, or aspects of reality we haven't conceptualized. Future developments in neuroscience, philosophy, and technology might reveal consciousness to be more or less dependent on biological substrates than current evidence suggests. As you drift toward sleep tonight, notice how your conscious awareness gradually fades as your brain shifts into different patterns of activity. The boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness illustrates the intimate connection between mind and brain states. Yet it also reveals consciousness as something more dynamic and flexible than a simple on-off switch. Your dreams will create rich subjective experiences from neural activity alone, suggesting consciousness is both deeply biological and remarkably creative. Rest well, fellow traveler, knowing that consciousness, whatever it ultimately is, represents one of the universe's most remarkable phenomena. Whether it emerges from matter or reflects something more fundamental, consciousness enables the very questioning we've engaged in tonight. In pondering whether mind can exist without body, we exercise the very capacity that makes the question meaningful. Tomorrow's consciousness will return with the morning light, bringing with it the continuing mystery of what it means to be aware in a physical universe.